Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on the ethics of gender equity in the workplace. And for those of you, which is a lot of you, who have not been to an Institute of Enterprise Ethics event in the past, welcome to the Institute as well. We're delighted to have you here. I'm Dan Sweeney, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics, and I'm very grateful that you chose to spend your morning with us talking about this very timely and very important topic. We are very proud to present this program to you in close cooperation with two partner organizations, the University of Denver's Colorado Women's College and the Women's Leadership Foundation of Denver. These two organizations have been very generous in sharing their resources and their networks, helping to recruit speakers and panelists, and certainly adding a great deal to the structure and the content of the program. I would like also to recognize and thank our sponsors, the sponsors of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics, without whose support we couldn't put these programs on. They include CoBank, and we're fortunate to have 2 or 3 CoBank people with us here this morning. Thank you very much. CenturyLink, previously Level 3, who provides us the opportunity to live stream events and such things as that require special kinds of technology. And the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative, a very powerful supporter, of course, of the Daniels College of Business. IHS Market, now mostly residing in London, but they've been a very strong supporter of the Institute over the years. Deloitte LLC has been a loyal supporter, and Sandy Roth is here with us this morning. And Newmont Mining as well. Thank you very much, Bill McGowan. And our 3 partner organizations, Net Impact, which is a global association of MBA candidates who are concerned about things like corporate integrity and sustainability. The National Association of Corporate Directors has been a good partner of ours, and Bill Heck, former president and I think still chairman, maybe former chairman of NACD. Thank you very much, Bill. And we're very timely, Rock Solid Design, who does all of our graphics and our marketing and adjusts my microphone on a moment's notice. Thank you, Andy. Also, please take a moment sometime, you don't have to do it right now, and look through the material inside your folder. Contains information about the Institute and information about the partners helping to put this program on. It has information about the speakers and panelists, and one folder at each table has a little surprise on it, which I'm going to tell you about in a little bit. That'll keep your attention on that for a while. Now let me explain to you the format we're going to use this morning. First, I'll be off the podium here very shortly, and I will have the pleasure of introducing Ann Ayers, who's the Dean of the Colorado Women's College, to welcome you and make some opening comments. We will then have 2 keynote speakers, Bill and Pam, and I will introduce them in more detail to you. And they're going to address 2 questions that we feel are very important to have serious discussions about. And then we'll give you the opportunity to have those serious discussions around your table with your table mates, trying to find practical responses to these questions and trying to find practical programs and processes to deal with them. Following that table conversation, we will have a panel in these same chairs of senior operating experienced executives with a moderator to have that same conversation and share it with you, and then they will also call on you to provide comments and questions and so on. We will then have some closing comments by the speakers and wrap it up, and my notes say we'll be wrapped up by 11:30 but we didn't get started on time, and I blame it again on I-25. So it may be a little after 11:30. Okay, so now I'm very pleased to introduce the leader of one of our partner organizations, the Colorado Women's College, Ann Ayers, who's the dean of the college, a recently appointed dean. Ann and I met very shortly after she became dean of the college, and I was very impressed with her enthusiasm and energy for this topic, and we got to work very, very quickly. Ann has been a leader in women's advancement here in Colorado through her work with the Leadership Investment Women's Vision Foundation for over the last 15 years. She was previously a senior strategist with Mission Minded, helping executives team develop marketing and branding and messaging strategies for their organizations. Ann started her career, and this is the part of her career I'm really envious of. Ann started her career with the Hogan Lovells law firm, where she represented the Paris office on the firm's global ethics panel. Ann, welcome.
All right, not quite as tall as Dan. I'm gonna try to stay as close to the microphone as this gentleman has told me I should. Raise your hand if for some reason the audio stops working and you can't hear. You can't hear you? Let's see. What if I use my big voice? Does that help? Is that better? Let's go for it. All right. People who work with me would say, you don't have anything but a big voice, so it's not really a surprise. I have the honor of welcoming everybody to the University of Denver today, and it still feels a little strange for me to do that because it's just been under 6 months since I accepted the appointment as the Dean of the Colorado Women's College here. And the University of Denver has made a really interesting and important move around women. I think that they have realized that the world needs more from women and needs to do more for women. And so in answer to that call, they've made a big change with the Colorado Women's College, which is that they've decided to take a 130-year legacy of doing single gender classes culminating in a bachelor's degree, and instead to say, how do we serve more women? How do we serve the emerging thought leaders in law and in business and in engineering and social work across this campus? And so when I had the opportunity when I was interviewing to meet with the chancellor and the provost and members of the board of advisors for the Women's College, their challenge to me was this: dream big. Dream about how you can help all of the women across DU's campus, faculty, staff, and students, and advance their careers. And so I thought that was a pretty good charter. But Rebecca Chop, Chancellor Chop, for those of you who know her, never stopped short of going really big. And she said to me, I want you to go beyond the footprint of DU's campus. I want you to take what is this amazing building and dream called the Chamber Center for the Advancement of Women, and I want you to make it a home and a place for women across our region, and nationally and globally eventually. And so that is my charge. I grew up on a ranch, and my dad would have said to me, they've given you just enough rope to hang yourself, Ann. Good luck. So I accepted that charge in September and gave notice to my previous employer. And I was going to start at the end of October. And as we're all aware, on October 5th, something shifted in the world for women. And the New York Times printed its article on Harvey Weinstein and released that. By the time I arrived at my desk on October 19th, my phone was absolutely ringing off the hook. And it was questions about, what is DU's position on this? What's the Women's College position on this? What are you going to do about it? We'd like to partner with you. And perhaps most markedly for me, a lot of men who were courageously confessing what a paralyzing time this is for them and how hard it is to be a leader. And so it's, you know, we're still sitting here in this moment where we're wondering who's next, right? Who's going to fall from grace? and we open the papers and open our websites every morning and wonder that. I think what we're doing here today and what we're compelled to do as leaders is to move from the question of who's next to the question of what's next. And for me, joining this group at the University of Denver, that's exactly what's happening. It's what's happening with our chancellor, in conversations with her, with our provost, with my fellow deans, with other leaders of influence like Dan. And it's an incredibly important conversation that we're having about how do we maximize the potential of this incredible watershed moment for women. And so I had the opportunity last week to be in California at the Watermark Conference, and I heard Jodi Kantor speak. She was one of the 2 reporters who broke the story on Harvey Weinstein. And she posed the question like this. She said, I wake up every day and I'm asking myself about the rocking chair. And I'm wondering if I'm sitting in a rocking chair 30 years out, and my grandchild walks up to me and they say, Granny, were you there at that moment when the Me Too thing happened? What am I going to say? Am I going to say I was there? I actually was the person who broke the story. And it was 6 months of incredible conversation and a year of courageous awareness that we had. Or am I going to say I was there and it's the moment that started everything? So I think that that's the question that I'm asking myself. And as I do that, I would love to tell you that I've had this, fabulous insight sitting at a cafe reading Maya Angelou or something like that. But I'm going to get real with you because I'm a working mom. And I'm going to tell you that it happened courtside for me at one of my son's, he has 7 years old, at his basketball game. And so I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to watch 7-year-olds play basketball recently. Success is like knowing which basket to shoot on, right? And a triumph is if you can actually hoist the ball high enough in the air to get there. So on this particular day, I'm sitting courtside, and I look out, and Nicholas is running up and down the court, and I'm noticing he knows what he's doing, right? He actually scores 2 baskets. He's got like 4 or 5 rebounds. And they match the players up man-to-man defense. Each player wears a colored band, and you find the kid on the other team with that band. He was actually sticking to the other kid with the yellow band. And I thought, this is like a proud parenting moment, not that I have anything to do with his basketball training. And so it was just fun to sit there. And the halftime buzzer rang, and the coach comes in, and he brings all the kids over, and he's got them, kind of sitting together. And he pulls out of the bag this enormous gold chain, right? And so there's this trend that's going on in college sports. I think it was started by the University of Miami, where players, after they've made a remarkable play, they get to wear this bling, this, Mr. T circa 1983 bling, and they sit on the sidelines, and that's the way that they get rewarded. So you can imagine all these 7-year-olds, they're looking up at this thing from Party City, I'm sure, and they're thinking like, this is the best thing ever. And the coach says, okay, here's the deal. The kid who gets the most rebounds gets to wear this for the team photo after this game and gets to take it home. So you've got, 5, 6, 7 kids who are like, I'm all over this, I'm doing this. So the buzzer goes off again, they go back to playing the game. Our team gets the ball, and there are 9 kids running down the court toward one basket. And I look, and my son is not one of the 9 kids. He's the missing part, and I think, like, where is he? And so I look, and I kind of reach over, and I look at the bench, and he's not there. And I think, did he go to the bathroom? What, did he get distracted? And there was this tall gentleman sitting next to me. I stood up, I look. And so 9 kids are at this end of the court. And I look down at this end of the court, and there's Nicholas standing under the opponent's basket like this. Right? Totally blew it. And I just had this moment where I was like, incentives, right? They're so important. It's like... All right. And Pam Jeffords and I go way back. We worked at Quest. She was in sales. I was in business development. And you probably, honestly, Pam taught me more about incentives than anybody I've ever known. So I really appreciate it. And as Pam talks to you, she's going to talk, probably, I'm going to guess, a little bit about the business case, which is part of the incentive that we think about and that I would encourage us as we set this up today to examine what are the incentives that we're putting in place and what are the yielding results. And so I think that the business case is really important, right? The business case is telling us really important things like there's a 44% greater return on equity when you have more women rising to ranks in your leadership in companies, and that's a statistic from McKinsey. If you start to look at the global effect from a GDP perspective, the number is unbelievable. What we're learning is that if we could advance toward more gender parity, we would add somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 trillion to the global GDP by 2025. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Here's the thing, though. That business case is important. It's incredibly important. It's part of the reason that we have Pam here. But it's not all important. It's not all encompassing. Because our actions aren't just driven by a business case, they're driven by values. And that's really important to keep in mind, and it's why I'm particularly grateful that Dan has kind of brought us into this conversation today. It was brought home for me, this whole point, very early in my career, when I was actually between my second and third year in law school. So I went to law school at the University of Virginia, and I had gone to Paris for this particular summer to work for a firm because it's where I wanted to start my career. And at the end of that summer, I interviewed with a number of firms that were local firms and were also the French branches of American firms. And I had had several successful interviews and was really excited about the potential. And I woke up one morning, I had one final interview with the Paris office of a New York law firm. And I called the assistant to the partner that morning to confirm the appointment, and she said, actually, I'm glad that you called. He can't meet with you today. But this person has a ticket to an event he's going to at UNESCO this evening. And we think it would be a great opportunity for you to kind of experience what's going on at UNESCO, and then he can conduct the interview with you there afterward. So chalk it up to a Colorado girl in Paris and a little naivete, and I thought, well, an evening event sounds great. And so I went to the UNESCO event, and I thought this will be a great cultural experience. There'll also be a potential for some networking. And I got there, and it would have been, except that I went in with this gentleman, and he didn't introduce me to anybody. I kind of sat like a prop next to him for a large part of the evening. There was absolutely no engagement at all. Sorry. And we got out of the event, and I was disappointed, and I was a little frustrated, and I was particularly upset because we hadn't had an opportunity to talk about my legal future, and this was a firm that I had really wanted to work for. So I knew that things weren't going the way I wanted them to, and he offered to give me a ride home, and again, it's 10:30 at night, I'm in a city that I don't know well, and I accept a ride home, I don't even think twice about it. And it only took me about 2 blocks to realize that he had no interest at all in my legal prowess or my legal future. He was interested in other things. And what was a bad evening turned into kind of a horrible evening. I managed to rebuff his advances and get out of the car. I think I actually slammed the door on his hand in the process. And I went home back to my French family, and I was confused, and as we hear a lot today in the press, I was embarrassed, and I was ashamed, not of my own action, but of somebody else's action. Here's where the story gets really interesting, though. 3 or 4 weeks later, I'm back at UVA's campus, and I'm talking with the Dean of Career Services, who's checking in with every single one of us about how our summer interviews went. And so he's going down the list and talking to me about my summer interviews, and he says, what about this firm in New York? And I said, oh, it was just kind of not very meaningful. And he said, no, really, what about it? And I kind of blew him off, really, and I exited the interview. Probably a week later, I'm back in his office. At this point, I had received offers from several of the firms, and I was talking with him about those offers, and he said, I want to circle back with you. I really want to understand. You didn't get an offer from this firm. You didn't really talk about the interview. It seemed like it would be a good match. And I sat there, and I absolutely loathed the idea that I would have to tell this man for whom I had tremendous respect and who I thought respected me and supported me, that I would have to tell him what happened, but he wasn't going to let me off the hook. So I started to tell the story, and I was able, thankfully, to preserve some of the details because the color of his face was changing, and I knew that he had gotten the gist. And in this really special moment for me, he looked across the table at me with this incredible amount of compassion and empathy, and he just said, don't move, just hold on for a second, Ann. And he picked up the phone, and he called the New York firm, and he said, I'd like to talk to the managing partner. And as he was waiting, and it seemed like an eternity for me, I remember, to this day, sitting in his office and wondering what he was going to do, but I knew he wasn't going to give up, whatever it was going to be. He managed to get the man on the phone, and he said, he expressed incredible disdain at the way that I had been treated at the hands of his Paris partner. The other thing that he did, and this is the part that marked me most, was he said, as long as I am the dean at this university, you and your firm are no longer welcome to recruit on our grounds. And I just thought, this is a decision that was not based on a business case. This is a decision that was based on his thought and how he valued me. And he had drawn an ethical line in the sand. And because it was based on morals and because it was based on his integrity, it made me feel two really important things. An undying loyalty to the University of Virginia. As much as I'm trying to bleed red and gold, maroon and gold, I will always bleed a little bit of orange and blue. And he gave me this great gift, was a sense of self-worth that was rooted in who I am, that's not rooted in what I offer through what I do for organizations. And that kind of longevity that stuck with me for the last 20 years, I think is the value that we have when we start to think about incentives that go beyond kind of, going after the gold chain. And so I just think that, I hope that we'll think about that today. So I want to go back to basketball for 1 minute. I don't want to talk about the YMCA this time and 7-year-old people. I'd like to talk about the Dallas Mavericks. Is everybody familiar a little bit with the story that's going on in the news now? A few head nods. It's a who's next story. So it broke earlier this week, and if you haven't seen it, then you'll pick it up in the next version of SI that you take a look at. The CEO of the Dallas Mavericks, it turns out, his name is Terdema Usuri, and he harbored for 18 years a culture of power abusive and predatory behavior at the Mavericks, one of the most successful franchises from a financial perspective in the NBA. And he left in his wake a tremendous amount of people who left and took their talent elsewhere because they couldn't stand the culture. And volumes of victims who were coming forward at this point and telling their stories and telling the impact that that had on their lives. He is, kind of, I think, an example of obviously of what we're trying to avoid. But what I will say about him too is he's a darn profitable leader. So he also left in his wake a history of a tremendous amount of financial success. And one of the women who was interviewed for this in the article, she said, as long as he was bringing in revenue, we knew absolutely that the team was going to turn a blind eye to the rest of this. So here's where this story gets interesting. He left in 2015. He left the Mavericks, and he went to Under Armour. So Under Armour is a competitor of Nike's that does sporting gear. And he went, and there was a lot of fanfare. There was a big announcement. We have a top executive. He knows how to bring in all kinds of sponsorship contracts, and a lot of fanfare. And 2 months later, he left pretty much without a word. And I read that, and I started to think to myself, 18 years, 2 months. 18 years, 2 months. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and we don't know where the story is yet. The story is still unfolding today. But I took the time last night to look up the values for Under Armour. And there are 8 of them, but I think the first 2 are enough to give us a sense of what might have happened. So the first value is love athletes. And the second value is stand for equality. I think that's what they did. Jane Addams is one of my favorite suffragists. She is a big part of the progressive era. And she says, action is the sole medium for the expression of ethics. And so we're at this time where this movement is big. It's really high profile. And I'm challenging myself and asking the rocking chair question and saying, as the dean of the Women's College at the University of Denver, how do I do more than ride the wave? And I'm so encouraged. We were so pleased with the numbers of people and the incredible balance of men and women who signed up for this. And so I feel like you all are implored to do the same thing. You're feeling the same thing that we are. So I want to welcome you to today. I want to tell you how excited I am to learn from you and your thought leadership, not just the panel, but the familiar friends and faces I see out here and all the wisdom I know is behind it. And I just want to say thank you so much for being brave enough to ask what's next.
Thank you, Ann. I've got this great urge to tell you about my granddaughter's basketball career, but I won't. I want to now turn to our two keynote speakers, and we've given each of them kind of an issue or a question to deal with, and to just kind of frame it. First, Pam Jeffords. I'm going to make you walk across here. And she'll give us some thoughts on why it's so hard to change a pervasive institutional gender bias in an organization. Pam is a partner at Mercer Human Resources Consulting, and has been helping companies deal with such issues for probably the better part of her career. She's also a board member of the VX, a for-profit LLC designed to inspire women to achieve their personal and professional bests. Pam also serves as a member of the Global Advisory Board for the CSU School of Business, and previously served as Vice President and General Manager for Paytech, a telecommunications company, and as Regional Vice President for Sales at Quest Communications. I was supposed to say welcome to the podium, but you're already here.
I'm already here, and I've got my big voice. I have to say, I was a bit nervous when Ann went down the Quest path, because I thought, oh my God, ethics, we can't. It's been 14 years since we left our offices at Quest, but it's shivers. There's some shivers still occasionally, but luckily we're past that point. But as Ann mentioned, it is an inflection point today in society and in business. And we're using the word inflection point because we can go one of two ways. We can just ride this out, kind of keep our heads down, hope that everything gets back to normal, or we can leverage this moment and really take advantage of it. And I think the consensus around the world is let's take advantage of it. And what we mean by that is something happened in the last 18 months, driven very much by the US, but this is having global implications. So when we look at the election results that were quite stunning for many people around the world, and there was a hint of sexual harassment happening during the election results, and then you add the Harvey Weinstein scenario, many people think, well, that was just too much too soon. But there's something that happened in the middle right before Harvey Weinstein, so probably around May or June of last year. The venture capital industry actually had their own awakening, and it was stunning and big. And it was not a situation where someone misunderstood a hug. It was, I will give you $2 million for your business if you sleep with me. Not super unclear. And the good thing is there was a quick and fast reaction to that. And I was very proud of how some of our Denver business leaders or Boulder business leader with Brad Feld and others, they came out very quickly and very publicly ashamed about the industry and put their zero tolerance policies, very descriptive zero tolerance policies in place. And it went pretty much unnoticed by anyone other than those of us in the business. But then Harvey Weinstein happened right afterwards. We were like, wait a second. And we tried to reflect on why that was a bigger deal than the venture capital. And what we realized was it was about the person receiving the behavior. So there's this underlying assumption that you have these powerful big business leaders and they're preying on these helpless victims. And when all of a sudden the helpless victim became a Gwyneth Paltrow or Angelina Jolie or a Reese Witherspoon, then people were like, wait a second, they could kick our ass. Like, and I would be scared, right? These are not helpless victims. These are not people who are desperate for money or desperate for power. These are people who have families that are legacy Hollywood, and yet they were still victims, and they still felt uncomfortable coming forward. And that's the moment when everybody said, okay, now we have to end this, because while Angelina Jolie and Reese Witherspoon were able to walk away, the individuals that are working in hotels and working in restaurants and need this money to survive cannot. So it's an inflection point, but it also is allowing us the opportunity to bring everyone together, courageous men, courageous women, courageous leaders, and say, the time for gender discrimination as a whole is over. And whether that's pay equity, whether that's pregnancy discrimination, whether it's sexual harassment, the time is now. So we have an opportunity at Mercer to present our When Women Thrive, Businesses Thrive research every year at Davos, at the World Economic Forum. And I know many of you have go to the World Economic Forum and schlep around in the ice. But this year, we were nervous that we were unprepared for the phones that were going to be ringing like Ann's did. So I was tasked to do some research around sexual harassment. And I had been working with Hollywood since actually February of last year, and not about sexual harassment. We were working on female directors. And so I was the appropriate person to kind of dig in and say, what's going on? So I have just a litany of lawyers and people sending me case after case of what was happening. And I am 5 generations from Louisiana, so love telling stories, love eating, love drinking. So it's not surprising that over Thanksgiving with my family, I think we were Mexican or something, and I was saying, listen, I figured this out. These acts kind of boil down to, some of them are just kind of creepy, and some of them are criminal. And then you got a little bit in between, right? And it was my brother who said, Pam, you have to add clueless, because we really sometimes don't know what we're doing is wrong. And so we need to have some type of feedback that says, hey, I'm not up for that hug, or, or something, or hey, I was uncomfortable with that action. And so I said, oh, this is even better. Clueless to creepy to criminal, right? And everything in between. So I was pretty proud of my marketing sales. I was like, so I go back to our Davos team and our branding, and I was like, I've got it. It's from clueless to creepy to criminal, right? And they're like, no, that would not be Mercer's brand. And so that is not elevated. So we downgraded a little bit to obnoxious to unlawful. That felt really good. Not as fun, but okay. So we go into Davos, and we're ready, and we've got our obnoxious to unlawful. I've got everybody prepped on the panel, and it's an exhausting time because you're 7 a.m. to midnight. So my boss, Pat Milligan, who has a lot of ears with PR, she's sitting around drinking again, drinking afterwards. She's relaxed. She's excited. She's interviewing with Bloomberg, and they bring up sexual harassment. They're like, what do you think about this? And she goes, well, it's what we call the 3 C's to sexual harassment, from clueless to creepy to criminal. So all of a sudden, headlines on Forbes, Davos takes on sexual harassment, from clueless to creepy to criminal. You can Google it, and that's what shows up. And all of a sudden, I got my brand in there, so I can say it. I was like, yes, and that's how it works, right? And it's very, very clever. And since then, I've had lots of people call me and add on things like, well, you got to add confused, and you got to add in crazy. And so we've got lots of C's coming out, so it's become very, very fun. But, so one of the questions that I was asked to pose was, with all these laws and regulation, and clearly a heightened sense of awareness and a moment, right, what's stopping us? So really what we found out through our work with the World Economic Forum is there's really 4 major issues, which is engaging men, the silent middle, the business imperative, as Ann mentioned, and then what we're calling unconscious behavior. So I'll kind of take you through how those come out. Well, for the last 4 years, every time we go to Davos, we talk about the role that men play in gender diversity. And every year, everyone says, yes, 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 and But we still haven't figured out yet how to truly engage men. And we're a bit worried that we're sliding back a little bit, because now we're hearing a lot of male leaders saying, I'm just not comfortable right now, the appearance, so I'm not going to mentor or go to dinner or travel with women until this whole thing blows over. And I'm like, well, yikes, that's a little illegal. And so we've kind of said the answer to sexual harassment is not gender discrimination. If you say, I am no longer going to mentor or travel or eat dinner with a woman, that in itself is illegal. You can say, I am not going to have dinner with anyone until this all blows over. I am not going to mentor a single person until this all blows over. That's not illegal. Might get in trouble with your boss because that's, not great, but you can say that. You can't say, I'm not going to mentor somebody because of their gender. So that's illegal. So unfortunately, our law friends, or their cases are going up, and we fear if people don't really understand, it's going to get worse. And so I set out to say, let's help people understand, what's from clueless to creepy to criminal and in the middle. And so we actually today are launching an infographic that helps people understand what, from the basics of what's illegal, what is just kind of clueless, what can get you fired, and we're hoping that using the right words. So we had an example where one of our clients, a man would actually not respond to any female's email. This is a true case. He would respond to only males' emails, no females, and the females figured this out. And so they filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against him. Well, it got denied because it actually isn't sexual harassment, it's gender discrimination. And so even just the verbiage that we use a lot is incorrect, right? What is unlawful, what's illegal, what's just clueless. And so this infographic we're hoping is going to help people. But I still get the very basic, questions. Pam, what about a hug? Can I hug now, right? So you go to Germany. I was in Germany and London last week, and that was the question, right? And I don't know, how many of you guys are in here are Catholic? I got some Catholics in here, right? So just think about that moment when they say, let's do the sign of peace, right? Peace be with you, right? And so you have that awkward moment where you go, is it a hug? If it's your kids, is it a kiss? If it's your spouse, is it a handshake, right? Or nowadays, is it you just totally sneezed and hacked all over your hands? So is it more of a gotcha, right? And my kids laughed at me last Sunday. I literally boxed them out to get wine. Like they were all four of them lined up, and I'm like, no, you are not going to get wine, right? And they're like, no, you can touch the bread, that's it, because the flu is just crazy, right? That's called social sensitivity. That's called being aware of what's around you. And people do not like that. They want to know, in this situation, I've met you once, I handshake. I know you, I hug. We handshake, but maybe we hug at the end of the day because we've been kind of good, right? That's called social sensitivity. It's an awareness. It's saying when somebody in Germany walks up and they've got their hand out, it's a handshake, it's not a hug. If somebody goes in for a hug and you kind of go, they need to be willing to receive that feedback. People are not comfortable with that. They want rules. And unfortunately, there aren't rules right now. It's about awareness. And what we found is social sensitivity is higher for women than men. So we do feel that men, especially male leaders, are not comfortable with that being the answer. They, again, want rules. So we're seeing companies like Google and Facebook coming out with dating policies. So now I think at Google you can ask a coworker out once, and if they say no, you can't ask them out again. So we're getting very tactical. You have dating agreements to where if you're dating, you agree on how you're going to break up. These are all things that are happening now. And again, we're not opposed to that because people do, it's just like church. We like guidelines, right? We're nervous, right? Because that's a very specific example, but many examples are very vague. So we hear a lot of CEOs going out with, we have a zero tolerance policy. And they're like, yes. And then you go, and so I always say, zero tolerance of what? And they're like, well, No, I don't. And so stopping the sentence short is what's causing the confusion. Is it zero tolerance of me giving Dan a hug, and Dan says, I didn't actually want a hug, am I fired now? So you have to finish the sentence. So I really do encourage you to look at Brad Feld's post from this summer, because at the Foundry Group, he actually defined what he was going to have zero tolerance for, and it was repeated acts of offensive behavior and certain behaviors that were going to be one time and you're done. And that's where we need to go with zero tolerance, is finish your sentence and define it, in order for us to all, again, feel good about how we're going to move forward. And so when it comes to engaging men, the one thing that we also have found is there's a growing population of men, white heterosexual men around the world, that are increasingly uncomfortable with this conversation. And we have not been successful engaging them. So we're working on the words that we need to start using. Some of the words, I actually had a client that posted on their board their metrics, and they actually had the words, we track diverse employees and non-diverse employees. I was like, well, who's like a non-diverse employee? And they're like, well, you know. Again, it's that you know, Pam. White heterosexual men, right? And that word in itself is one, it's factually not correct, right? A person cannot be diverse. You can only be diverse in relation to someone else, right? So when somebody says, I hired they're very excited, Pam, I had a diverse person yesterday. I'm like, so you hired a non-white heterosexual man, right? So we're getting all caught up in these words, but they make a difference because they're excluding this population of men. And it's a very rising concern, especially in the tech industry. Don't look at this website now, but on your personal computers, there's a website called Men Going Their Own Way. It's called MGTOW, MGTOW.com. Again, don't go on your work computer. It is a growing white supremacy site for white heterosexual men and don't play that back on the recorder because we don't want to give them any press. White heterosexual men going their own way. These are highly educated men in the tech sector that have come together, and man, I am seriously jealous of their website. Like, it is amazing. Lights like this blowing up. And they now have chapters in Canada, US, and Europe, and they're growing. And their premise is all based on facts. And so that it kind of leads to what Ann was saying, is you can't only lead with $12 trillion, because for every data point I can give you on why diversity and inclusion is good, there is a corresponding data point on why homogeneous teams work better together. And so their site is full of very interesting facts. Most inventions in the world today were created by white men who were not married and don't have children. And so they go on to tell you all these amazing things that had happened. And so their propaganda is, it actually says, do not get married, right? I mean, like, do not get married, do not have children. And I'm like, you're actually talking about ending the population. Like, seriously. So kind of think through that a little bit more. But it's interesting. So go on, kind of look at, because you need to understand what this population of people are saying so that we can understand and figure out how to get them to the table. So we've started to use words like, when it comes to gender, no one is an ally. We're all a gender. So when we're talking about male allies, we can be allies when it comes to sexual orientation. So I am an LGBTQ ally. I am a veteran, an ally of the veteran community. I would not be an ally of gender. I am a gender, right? And so even those words, helping men understand how to authentically come into the conversation, it has been very important and eye-opening for a lot of men. 4 years ago, we started coaching men on how to talk about the business imperative for diversity and inclusion without it being about their daughters. And so we used to make jokes. I got lots of great laughs. I would say, first guy, I could literally time you and bet someone. Guarantee he's going to get up here and talk about his daughter. And I'd bet $5 I'd win every time. And then they would get there and say, I care about diversity and inclusion because I have a daughter. And the reaction of the women was, so you didn't give a shit about us for 20 years. But now you have a daughter and you care about us, right? So that's one. Two, people of color would say, so you can care about your white daughter because she's family and you can have empathy for her, but what about us? What about people of color? What about veterans? What about LGBTQ? So attaching your diversity and inclusion imperative to your family member leaves out this other group. So I got tons of laughs on that one. But then I fast forward and you realize data alone is not solving this either. So it has to be a balance between data and sensitivity. It has to be storytelling and facts. which is right up my alley because I love storytelling. So whenever we present to leadership, we actually have a method where we say, you tell a story, you go back to the data, you tell a story, you go back to the data. It can be about your kids, but understand that when you're in a room that's mixed race, mixed gender, understand that your narrative around why you care about diversity and inclusion may not move the audience. And so I always ask CEOs, are you up here to impress them or inspire them? If you're up here to inspire them, they're not inspired by your daughter. Or my CEO was like, all right, and then the next, he got up and talked about his granddaughter. I'm like, still not inspiring. And so now he jokes about it. He'll get up in Davos and go, Pam tells me I can't talk about my kids and my grandkids, so I think he's talking about his dog next. But the point being is, when we're up here talking, we have an obligation to inspire people to action, and many times it is more about impressing people, and that's, again, a tough conversation we have with a lot of CEOs. The second I mentioned is the silent middle, and the reason we call them silent middle is they will sit in a speech like this, and the other day I was with a client, we had 2,000 people, and they're all nodding their head, the majority of them. Then they go back to their desk and they don't do anything. That is the problem in US and Europe right now, is we see movement at the top, we see movement at the bottom. It's that middle that we just can't seem to connect with. And what we found is that this $12 trillion to the global economy, which is now actually rise, we hear it's now upwards to $20 trillion to the global economy if we can close the gender gap, is enough for CEOs, board members, world leaders. That is enough. They want their 12 trillion and they want more than their share. To the middle manager, it is not enough. That doesn't impact them, or they can't see how it impacts them. So we started to talk about the difference between what offends us from what impacts us. And so I started this conversation a year ago, right after the elections, to say certain things can offend us. It offends a lot of people that there's not more women represented in leadership. It offends us that people of color are not represented the right way. Sexual harassment absolutely offends us. But what impacts us is how we actually do our job and how we vote. So when we look at why certain women voted for Trump, they might have been offended by everything he did, but what they said is, I personally was not impacted. I didn't have an experience with sexual harassment myself. I don't have a family that's in trouble of being deported. So what impacts me is my paycheck. And I believe my paycheck will go up with Trump, so that's why I voted for him, but I was completely offended by him. So I bring that logic of being able to separate what offends us from what impacts us back to Hollywood last year, again around February, and to the studios, and I said, this is it, guys. You have to figure out what impacts them. And they just pushed back on me and said, that's ridiculous. We need to do things and vote and act based on what we morally believe is right. And so they kind of pushed me aside and didn't let me kind of go forward with my campaign around that. And so I'm a consultant, so it's kind of, that's what we do. We just go, great, you didn't like it, we move on, give you another idea. So I gave them another idea, they liked that. Now fast forward to the summer when Harvey Weinstein came out, and all of a sudden they're like, hey, you remember that? Come on back. And I said, yeah, you had your moment, right? So all of these studio execs absolutely knew what he was doing. They absolutely knew that there's probably, unfortunately, a lot more. But what impacted them was they make amazing films. So they were able to ignore what offended them and vote and act based on what impacted them. And that was their moment, and only then did they realize that that's what they had been doing, is separating what offends them from what impacts them. And then I had them. And then we're going forward, we're doing an amazing event in March, next week. God, I hate to say it's March 8th, International Women's Day, back in LA. And we're going to be talking about how we separate it. That's what your middle managers and your silent middles are doing. They may be offended that women are not in leadership, but what impacts them is it's so much easier to call the same people that I always call to get the same recruits. So we end up hiring people that look like us because it's easier. It's not because we have some deeply unconscious bias. It's just easier. So the last one is the business imperative and unconscious behaviors. So I think we covered unconscious behaviors, and I want to make sure I give enough time to others. But unconscious behaviors is the other one we're toying with. The word unconscious bias unfortunately, we just can't even use anymore, right? Because we've killed the word. And to most people, what they believe now is because I'm 5 generations from Louisiana, clearly I don't like black people somewhere in my history. And I may not know it, but I'm probably not hiring black people because of my 5 generations. That's what people think when they talk about unconscious bias, is there's something deeply held in me that I don't even realize is happening. And that's not resonating with most people, because play it out for me in how it actually is happening. What's the behaviors that we have? And so, so some of the behaviors are, my daughter's a freshman at Colorado School of Mines, and so I have 4 kids. So she's going for scholarships. Anybody have a scholarship? Bring it on for her. So she's going for a scholarship. She's a civil engineer at Colorado School of Mines. So she got asked to come in for a scholarship, and she gets there and she texted me and she said, "Mom, I'm the only white person in the room." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I think that this is a minority scholarship." And I said, well, in some instances, you're a blonde, blue-eyed, 6'1" homecoming queen. You would be the minority in engineering and civil engineering at Colorado School of Mines. So I don't know. So I was trying to kind of make her feel easy, but she felt super uncomfortable. And so I said, "You're not leaving. If it was a mistake and they invited you, then you're going to stick it out and you're going to feel what it's like to be the only person." So it's a good learning experience. So she gets the scholarship, and it turns out it was a Bridging the Gap scholarship to bridge the gap between different racial and ethnic groups. White was one of the groups, right? And so she comes home and she gets the scholarship. She's excited, and but she's nervous. She goes, "Mom, I feel like I'm taking money from people who need it more than me." She's this is out of my 4. She's the most philanthropic, very, very smart, obviously. And very deeply connected to the community, but she was very concerned. And I was like, "Let me be clear, we need the money, right? 4 kids going through college. I'm good with this." But I said, "Well, why do you think that?" And I looked at the other kids who got awarded the scholarship. And these are groups of kids who are underrepresented in the engineering field. But I look at them and I recognized one of the moms was a heart surgeon. One of the dads played for the Broncos. One of the other dads is a big engineer. And so I'm thinking, they've got money. So I asked her, I said, "Why did you think that?" In her mind, the word underrepresented meant poor. Those are unconscious behaviors. Those are unconscious statements. That's what we're talking about. And here's a person who meant no harm. She was actually wanting to do good. And we associate words incorrectly. When you play that narrative out, that makes total sense for middle managers. They're like, "Oh, I get that. I could have made that same mistake," right? So again, if we have to finish the narrative for these middle managers. We have to tell them, here's what an unconscious bias looks like. Here's the behavior that's exhibited. Here's how it's maybe not ill-intended, but how it comes across, right? So the last one I'll leave you with is this is hard. This is not easy, and it's not going to be easy. And any organization who is not taking a change management approach to diversity and inclusion is going to continue to spend a ton of money with no effort, with no results, because it is a culture change, and it's not easy. And so I'll give you the example, I live and breathe this every day, right? So I get on an airplane going to a funeral a few months ago with my husband, and I fly a bunch. So I get upgraded to first class at United, and my husband, on my status, gets a really nice exit row seat, right? So he's happy. We were in a funeral, so I'm in black. He wore jeans and a sweatshirt because it was a 4-hour flight. He wanted to be comfortable. So we kind of kiss and say goodbye. And I sit down, the flight attendant says, "Your husband is so nice to give you his upgrade." And I'm like, "Ah." And so I sit down and I'm like, I seriously just want my Prosecco, right? And I know how much she likes me is how many I get, and she impacts that. So I'm just sitting there going, I don't want to say anything. Because why? I wasn't offended. I really wasn't impacted at all. But there's people around, there were kids around, there were other people around who she was pointing out to me, "You don't belong here. You look odd in this seat." So I was like, "All right, I've got to say something, dang it." So I was like, "Actually, this is my upgrade." And she goes, "Oh, really? She goes back, she looks, she sees I'm a 1K, and she's like, wow, what do you do for a living? Like, a woman, right? And so I'm like, oh my God, is this a game? Are we going to go around the table and see? And the guys next to me are like, and I said, I'm actually a gender diversity consultant. And the guys are like, oh my God, So her reaction to this is perfect. She goes to the back to my husband, who's reading his paper, and says, I just saw how much your wife flies. I am so sorry. That must be really tough on you. Can I bring you something from first class? And he's like, what do you got on tap? And he's texting me going, I got a hamburger, I got a beer, this is awesome, right? So I tweeted to United and said, epic fail. And I'm kind of laughing, I'm saying, just as an FYI, you probably want to give your flight attendants some gender-biased training because you want to make sure everybody in first class feels welcome. And I leave it at that. And they write back to me and said, glad you liked your upgrade, yay us. And then they said, sorry she had a miscue. Well, first, I didn't say I was a woman, so they assume it's a she. And they said miscue. So I'm kind of in the air, but I'm thinking, that's a weird word. Well, my Twitter followers are all D&I leaders, right? And one of the new D&I leaders for Uber, a friend of mine, Bo Young Lee, I don't know how she stays employed because some of her tweets are very, very racy. So she says, she just jumps on them. She goes, what cue did they miss? And so they weren't going to let them off the hook. And I was like, well, and I said, let me give you the cues. We walked in, I was in business attire, he was in jeans. I sat in the seat, he didn't. The only clue was my gender. So let's kick that. It was a gender issue. And then they write back and said, well, we're so sorry that you were discriminated against. I was like, again, no, wasn't discriminated against. Sat in the seat, had my Prosecco, I was good. And they kept going on using all these words about how I felt. And I was like, time out. I feel nothing. I am actually quite happy in my seat. I'm good. I got leg room. I got my Prosecco. My husband is super excited back here. We feel nothing. You have a training opportunity in your company, and I'm just merely giving you feedback. Don't need anything from you. Don't need an apology, nothing. But they couldn't figure that out. And that's how most people feel, is if I were to say, I really am not a hugger. I'm not offended, but people make it such a big deal when you give them feedback about something maybe they said or did. And that's what we have to explore for companies, is how do you make giving feedback? How do you make social sensitivity? How do you make conversation less uncomfortable? Because it's hard. Because I don't want to be the person that sits up here and critiques every person's word and said, oh, you used the word diverse person again, or you said this and it was a gender stereotype. It's not fun, trust me. So I do believe, and this is one of the reasons we're working with tech companies, I do believe it's a technology. Think of a Fitbit that kind of buzzes you every time you say something wrong, or gives you feedback at the end of the day and says, hey, you had 10,000 steps and you said 5 things, right? That's my vision of where it's going to come so that we can, again, use this inflection point to move forward. So with that, thank you.
This is a little acrobatic test here, walking across this thin podium. Thank you very much, Pam. Our second keynote speaker will discuss how an organization can propagate and encourage a culture that promotes gender ethics and power equity in the workplace. As Executive Vice President for Human Resources at Newmont Mining, and formerly as Chief Human Resources Officer for Sun Microsystems, Bill McCowan is well experienced and well prepared to deal with this question. How's that for a Bill's also served as a board member and as special advisor to the board of Weighin, a digital marketing platform company, and as director on the board of Sabra, a talent management software company. Please join me in welcoming Bill McCowan.
So I don't have a great outside voice, so raise your hand in the back as I'm going along if I start to fade. Sorry about that. When I'm at parties, people don't pay attention to me. My voice kind of drifts into the background, so hopefully we'll do fine on this. So you may not know a lot about Newmont Mining. We're pretty low key, a 95-year-old company. I think we're Colorado's second largest company. We have a market cap of around 20 billion, about 13,000 employees, headquartered in Greenwood Village. 75% of our employees are outside the U.S. in countries like Peru, Suriname, Australia, and Ghana. We've been the leader in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index the last, you're already not hearing me? Okay. We've been the leader in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index the last 3 years, and we were just named the most admired company in mining by Fortune magazine. I've been head of HR since 2010. When I first joined Newmont, Newmont was a very distinguished 90-year-old company, very conservative, very ethical, but diversity and inclusion were absolutely not on the table and were not a discussion item in the HR group. And our results really showed that. If you're a really good company and you don't discriminate and you just kind of plod along, you're not going to get great results. Newmont had no senior executive women on the executive staff and was 9% female globally. Pretty pathetic and bleak results. And that just shows you that you've got to do more than just plod along and be compliant. You've got to be proactive. It's a tight market out there for qualified women. The women in this room, I'm sure, have lots of choices, and you've got to compete for that if you're going to make progress. You can't just be kind of running the mill. Fortunately, at Newmont, our board of directors was very progressive. In 2010, we had 3 female board members, all very strong. We now have 5, including our chairman, Noreen Doyle, and then our head of our comp committee is also female. When our new CEO came on board in 2012, Gary Goldberg, the board made it clear to both Gary and I that they expected things to change and they expected to see some progress. So we've been at this for about 5 or 6 years. We're very proud of our progress. We've made good accomplishments, but it's going to be a long journey. We have a long way to go. So what I'm going to be sharing is some of the things we've learned kind of the hard way over the last 5 or 6 years, but absolutely I could learn from everybody in this room in terms of progress that we still need to make. I should state, first of all, that it's a real pleasure to be here, and Newmont has a real tight relationship with the DU. We've go way back, and we have been co-developing our executive development program with the business school here, and so we had our executives in this building just about 3 weeks ago. The 3 learnings that I'm going to share, and then I'll go into detail on each of them. One is you really need a strong commitment at the top, that you've got to be intentional in your commitment. You've got to be serious about inclusion and diversity and make it a company value, part of your culture. And that you need, if you're a global company, you need to transcend the standards of the countries you operate in. The second item is that you've got to exhibit leadership at all times, role model, and also take action in the moments of truth or the moments of matter. And then third, and this is really to Pam's point, you've got to involve the majority, and you can't just focus on your demographic subsets if you're going to move a company's culture forward. So let me start back then on the first point and talk about executive commitment. So at Newmont, I feel like we've had terrific commitment. And part of the way that is expressed is through our company values. I think Ann mentioned that previously. Newmont redid our values when our new CEO came on board. We have 5 values, and inclusion is one of those 5 values. Newmont views values as kind of guideposts for making decisions, and that they will be enduring and long-lasting. And you know, our business strategy may change, our purpose and mission may change, but our values will stay. And so we're really pleased that inclusion was selected. It really represents the people commitment of the company. And I know our executive team, when we decided on the values, this was about 6 years ago, felt that if you had an inclusive culture, so much else goes along with that. If you have an inclusive culture, you pretty much you will feel that you have high employee engagement, that employees will feel trust and will speak up when they see issues, that career development needs are being surfaced and addressed, and that everyone feels that they can succeed. So that inclusion is a lot more than just diversity and inclusion. It's about a way of doing work. And we think that if companies propagate and articulate values, that can go a long way in making sure it's clear to all employees what your standards are. One of the decisions that we had to make as well as a global company, and I mentioned that we're in countries like Ghana and Peru, and we were just recently in Indonesia. You've got to really make it an ethical decision about how are you going to approach work in those countries. I know this came up when I worked in high tech, when we had business operations in Saudi Arabia. What are you going to do in Saudi Arabia? You're going to follow the local laws. You have to in order to do business. But what else more can you do? Or are you going to choose not to do business there? And that was a decision that I know the Sun Microsystems team grappled with. For Newmont, it's, do we adjust to the cultures that we do business in based on their cultures to fit in with their laws and culture? Or do we set a high bar and say, if you're going to work at Newmont, you're going to follow a global high standard regardless of the country that we operate in? Obviously, it was the second of those that we chose to follow. And so we have codes of conduct and standards that are way above what's required in the United States, but also in places like Ghana and Peru and Suriname. And it can create some issues because you've got a pretty big cultural gap for the people that have grown up there, the employees that have grown up there, particularly the managers, on what they're used to culturally versus the standards of Newmont. So it puts a real obligation on us to make sure we're clear and that we've trained people on those standards and that managers know they must live up to them if they're going to stay working for the company. You do get disconnects. And we've experienced those in some of those countries, and so the answer is much more training and drawing a line in the sand. And luckily in those countries, we have almost zero attrition. So people really like working for Newmont. We're usually the best employer in the country. So the fear of job loss keeps people in place until you can convince them of what the right decision is. And so it keeps people in place, but we're absolutely working year after year to make sure they understand and take it from their heart about these standards and not just do them to comply. I was in a meeting in South America about 5 years ago when one of our general managers spoke up, and it was a business meeting I was facilitating, and he said, it's the first time I ever heard this spoken out loud, he believed that women's place was not in the workplace, that they should be at home raising kids, and that he disagreed with the company's approach that we were taking. And I addressed him certainly in the meeting, but then took him aside privately and said, you've got to get on board with this. If you're going to be a leader at the company, if you want your career to progress, if you want to stay in your role, you're going to need to get on board. Shortly thereafter, he left the company, and Newmont was fine with that. He was a high performer, but that wasn't going to work for us. And we're really glad that he's self-selected out. So I've said that values are one way to articulate to your employees kind of what's important. Another is the role modeling that leaders do, and I know this is a bit obvious, but there's a lot of ways you can role model. Luckily, we have a board and a CEO and an executive team that not only sets requirements, but really demands that the company role model and live these values every day. It's not just to be supportive, but it's to put it into action. And some examples that we teach our leaders to do is they make sure whenever we have a panel discussion to make sure that there's an equitable number of gender diversity of speakers. You'd be surprised how often that happens if you're not conscious about it. We make sure our leaders ask tough questions of their own staffs. What are you doing to achieve our diversity targets? Where are you on the candidate slates for this opening? What are you doing to promote high potential females? So we're doing a lot of training on managers to make sure that the leaders are asking the right questions. Another is that whenever our leaders travel to sites, and this goes for our CEO and our executive team, we always arrange meetings of diverse groups of employees, depending on the country, for engagement. And it's to try to keep a handle on what's happening and what the issues are, and to keep that trusting dialogue going. We also, of course, want leaders to put money where their mouth is and to allocate resources. Newmont started with the hiring of a director of inclusion and diversity in 2012, someone that Pam worked with that Facebook stole away from us, so there's high tech for you. And we have a great new Ghanaian head of diversity and inclusion. But then since then, we've added diversity and inclusion resources in all of our regions. We have funded 20 business resource groups or employee resource groups, and we've rolled out inclusive training for all of our people managers. We also set targets for our demographics, which can be controversial because in some cases we set targets maybe before some of the countries that we were operating in really understood why. If we were doing it all over again, I'd still do it though, because it's funny, Newmont has an execution-oriented culture, and if someone has a goal, they do it, and I think they've learned by doing the goal. I don't think they were there with their hearts 6 years ago, but I think a lot of them have gotten there now. And then also our CEO and all of our executives have signed up for a program called Paradigm for Parity. This is a global initiative that's where CEOs make a commitment for gender parity in corporate America by 2030. With that commitment, you agree to implement 20 very practical programs, things like blind resumes and candidate slating and things like that, that will help you achieve gender parity by 2030. 3 of our board members were amongst the 80 women that developed that program, so we're very proud to be one of the early adopters of that. Another point of role modeling is to take action when in the moments of truth. And that's not only rewarding people for good behavior, it's also taking action when you see unacceptable behavior. The point that I think is really important is if you're a leader in a company, you can never break character, and I don't even know if that's the right expression, but you can't stand in front of a group and espouse diversity and inclusion and then tell a joke with your 2 closest friends. Employees are watching you constantly. Your staffs are watching you. They want to know that what you're doing is authentic. And so you can never take a break from that. And I often ask Pam what's the right way to express that. But that's something I'm really proud of Newmont, because I've never seen that, behind the curtains with the CEO, never a change in attitude or expression. And it makes you feel good that it really is authentic. And I believe it is. So we do celebrate outstanding leaders. Our Assistant General Counsel, Nancy Lipson, was just recently recognized as one of Colorado's 25 most powerful women. But we've also taken swift action when we've had breaches of ethics, and we do it very clearly, and we do it regardless of grade level. We had about 2 years ago, we had 2 of our executives in Africa that we had to terminate for sexual harassment. And I went to the board to explain that we had taken this action. And the board really asked me, as did Gary, our CEO, what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And we looked at all of our hiring practices, because in some cases these were people that hadn't been on board a long time. We looked at our hiring processes, our profiling, our assessments, our performance review process, all of our internal standards to see what we could do to make sure that ethics and style were emphasized more. But I also made a commitment that I would travel to each of our regions and train all people managers on a program called Respect in the Workplace, which was a very down-to-earth, draw a line in the sand program to make sure all of our managers understood our code of conduct, our actions, and that we would not tolerate, 0 tolerance for any exceptions. And we feel good about that because it ended up being about a year before all the Me Too effort. And when all of that came out, and we've seen lots of examples where companies have allowed harassment and discrimination in their workplace, and frankly, where we've seen some ineffective HR organizations where they either haven't stepped up or they haven't been allowed to step up to address some of these issues. I know I wouldn't want to work for one of those organizations, and I don't think you would as well. So it's on all of us to make sure that we're speaking up and taking action whenever we see a cause for concern. There's always avenues to do that. As a leader, you should be asking your employees constantly at your direct level and at skip level meetings, what's going on? What, are there issues that I need to know about? Because if issues aren't getting to your attention, that doesn't mean they're not happening. It just means they're not being reported to you. So Newmont, like almost every other major employer, uses lots of techniques: pulse surveys, employee surveys, ethics hotlines, skip level meetings, et cetera, to really check out our marketplace of employees to understand what's going on, what are the issues, and to get ahead of issues if there are some. So in addition to the first 2 points, getting top level commitment and role modeling behavior. The last point is really this dealing with the majority of your employees, and the term allies. I think at Newmont we use allies as a very positive term, meaning that for all of our diverse groups, et cetera, we always encourage membership beyond that group, and that's one of the requirements of the leaders, is that they will seek out membership from, for example, our women's group at our corporate office is co-led by a man. And because one of our board members, Ronnie Hagan, a former CEO, has made it really clear to us, and it sounds like this has been discussed at Davos, that you're not going to change the culture of your company by addressing your women or addressing your gay employees or et cetera. You've got to move the majority of employees forward. And that means in Ghana, the majority of your employees are Ghanaian nationals. In Peru, it's Peruvian nationals, whatever your majority is. But you've got to move that core group forward. You can't focus on the subsets. And so you want each of those decision makers, for example, in the US, the majority of our decision makers are men. And we want to bring our men along so that they understand and are questioning themselves, and they're questioning the organization to make sure any of the decisions or the decisions of the company are not biased in any way. We want to drive that awareness. We know that men and women see things differently. That McKinsey studies showed that if men are in an organization where there are 10 senior leaders and one is a female, the men will feel that the women are well represented. We want to make sure that our male executives understand that that isn't acceptable, and that what is the reality of the situation, and asking them to champion change. Our business resource groups have been a very positive mechanism for Newmont, and I know they're a little controversial now, because some companies that have been at this for many years, I think Deloitte's an example, have started to move away from them, feeling that they were divisive. But for Newmont, and we have, as I mentioned, 20 global groups, they've been very much a positive environment for us, and have really helped to drive engagement. We have groups, we try not to have groups that are siloed. We have groups focused on women's issues, but a lot of the participants in those groups are men. We have LGBT groups, and many of the participants of those are heterosexual allies. We have veterans groups, a group focused on cultural diversity. We have wellness groups, et cetera. So we've worked very hard to try to keep groups from siloing off. About half of our groups globally are focused on gender diversity. And I think they've been one of the most powerful influences for change, definitely improved engagement, and we see them continuing at our company, even though I know some companies are thinking about going the other way. You also, when you're dealing with the majority, you have to deal with some of the backlash. And there's always a subset of employees that don't agree or resist or don't understand. We try to interpret it as that they don't understand, and we do a lot of training, but you've got to be sensitive to what the issues are being raised. In Nevada, where we have 4,000 employees, and it must be the strongest Trump supporting area in the world. I know men there have spoken to me about feeling that their career paths are threatened, or feeling that the company is hiring women that are less qualified for men, lowering our talent standards in order to make a point on diversity. And you must address those concerns head on. You don't want them out there festering. And one of the things we've done is train all of our executive team and ask them these tough questions so that they're prepared to address them, and they don't stumble on the answer when it comes up in a town hall meeting or in a one-on-one with an employee. We've also done inclusive training for people managers. We're still doing unconscious bias training, which we find helpful. And the point is that we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable to address these issues, and that we minimize the number of people that are feeling this backlash or resentment on some of our program. We've tried in our communications to focus a broader message of diversity and inclusion, but in no way do we downplay our emphasis on growing women's presence in our company. We don't want to downplay that at all, but we want the men to understand. So that's what we've done the last 5 or 6 years. We've made a lot of progress. Our percentage of females on the board with our executive team, people managers, global representation have all gone up significantly, and we're getting some nice recognition for that. But we're on a journey that's going to last a long time. So if I had any words of wisdom, it would, commitment from the top, values, take action in the moments that matter, and bring your majority populations along in your decisions. So please let me know if I can help in any way. Reach out to me, and I'm happy to help. And I'll turn it over now to Dan.
Right. Thank you very much, Bill. Sort of messages from the trenches. Thank you. So we've had exposed to a lot of great ideas, commentaries, observations, some good jokes. So now it's your turn to make a contribution to this conversation. We're going to have you turn inward toward your tables and talk with your table mates about what you've heard. Please keep in mind that your charge is to focus on what can be done. What steps would you suggest? What processes or attitudes or whatever you come up with could you share with the rest of the group based on these conversations? And then following your table conversations, we'll have a panel of experienced and seasoned executives up here to have this conversation with you. Now, at each table, one of the folders on the table has a yellow sticker on the inside right cover. If your folder has a yellow sticker on the inside, you will be your table's discussion leader. And you will have the opportunity to go to a microphone that will be in the middle of the room here when your table is called upon to give a comment or a question or a challenge to the panel. Congratulations. That's the surprise I talked about earlier today. And please join me in a round of applause for our speakers this morning. And so to get this started off, I'll introduce the panel moderator. Gloria Zamora is founder and chief executive officer for Success Innovators, a consulting firm focusing on organizational change, development, and alignment, serving companies in a variety of industries around the world. Gloria also serves as chair of the board of directors of DSST Public Schools, a group of open enrollment STEM charter schools here in Denver. Previously, Gloria served as Vice President for Human Resources at both BNSF and Coors Brewing. Gloria, it's all yours.
Thank you. It is quite a pleasure to be here, and especially because I'm accompanied with some very impressive people you will enjoy talking with. And let me begin with my friend Jane Okumbamba. Jane is president of Saddle Ridge Consulting, and until recently, and how I got to know her, she was chief administrative officer of IHS Markit. She also is a board member of Kickstart International, a member of the advisory board of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, her alma mater, and previously Director of Investor Relations at several companies, including Media One and Northwest Airlines. Jane Okumbamba. Sandy Roth, next to Jane, my new friend, is the managing partner of Deloitte here in Denver. He is a board member and past chair of the Rocky Mountain Junior Achievement, a member, Board of Trustees of the Denver Area Council, Boy Scouts of America, member, Board of Trustees of the Denver Botanical Gardens, member, Global Leadership Council, and CSU College of Business. Sandy.
Thank you.
And Jolynn Whiting, who I work very closely with on the Women's Leadership Foundation board, is chair of the Women's Leadership Foundation. She's also a successful consultant in marketing and telecommunications, previously an entrepreneur in the home healthcare industry. She was also vice president and general manager of US West. Jolynn.
Thank you.
So I am going to ask each of them to make some opening comments, and then I have the pleasure of asking them some questions, and then we will turn to you to let your conversations inform questions that you might have for the panel. I first want to say that as I thought about this event today, it really informed my thinking about where do I see greatness around this topic. And invariably, it's where you have leaders that are forward-thinking, that are based in gender ethics, who see this as not something that's trendy, but something that's imperative. And what we have seen, and some I think Bill talked about, you have to think about it as a change process, where we see leaders awaken, fabulous things happen. Things happen. And so in my work, as I work with CEOs and executive teams, my byword is leaders matter. And we're all leaders. We can all be leaders among leaders. And so as I was driving here, I was thinking, what part do I play? How do I contribute to advancing gender ethics? And very importantly, and something that was reinforced in our comments today, what are those assumptions that I have been carrying around that it's time to re-examine and to really think about through that lens of sensitivity? So as you hear our panelists talk and as you hear questions from the floor, I challenge you to think about how can you be a leader among leaders, and what is that one idea, assumption that you might be carrying around that it may be time to rethink. So with that, I'm going to start with the external world, and I'm going to ask Jane. You have you've had a lot of involvement with investors, and it's a fast-changing pace of involvement that investors are having on a multitude of issues. And so I'd like to ask you, what is the impact that investors are having on the whole topic of gender ethics?
Great, sure. First, good morning, everyone, and it's a real privilege to be here. Thanks to DU for the invitation and for sponsoring this. I think this is such an important topic, and having these discussions is critical to galvanizing all of us around this. And we've heard some great information already this morning. And great to be up here with my esteemed panelists, longtime friends, Gloria and Jolynn, not long time and long tenured, and new friend, Sandy. So,
New friend.
going to be a long-time friend.
Thank you.
I have spent many decades working between primarily publicly traded companies and the Wall Street investment community and investment banking community. That community in particular has an immense impact on companies' ability to fund themselves. And so their value system often is imposed upon companies in the way they make decisions. I have long said that until the investment community starts to care about this subject of gender equity and gender diversity, particularly, and maybe starting with the boardroom, which is the ultimate governing body of any large company, and then also the C-suite, it's going to be very hard to have change throughout a whole organization. I would say that in the past 3 to 5 years, I've actually started to see change. And we heard from both Anne and Pam this morning that we're at this very seminal moment now because of some very important events that have happened. And I think the pace of change in the investment community is happening very quickly. So one of the things I've done historically just in my role with publicly traded companies is to reach out to the top 30 or so investors of my particular company. And I've asked them, how are we doing from a governance standpoint? And you know, governance is a very broad topic. In the past several years, I have started hearing from these investors, we're getting concerned with your lack of gender diversity on your board. And there is a lot of academic research, particularly around gender diversity, that shows that companies who have more gender diverse boards, and then this would also relate to C-suites as well, but particularly focused on boards, those companies have better track records in the long term. They are more sustainable. They take on a more appropriate level of risk for their business, and financial returns and shareholder returns are greater over the long term. So there is a ton of research on this, and Wall Street is finally starting to notice this. And so in my conversations, I've been hearing your board's not diverse and your C-suite is certainly not diverse. I've spent 13 years as the only executive on my company's executive team. And the message has been, we're not going to do anything right now, but should there be some other issue with your company, this lack of diversity is going to become a huge problem for you. And so I've been communicating that to the boards I've worked with. Now, we've seen in the past 2 weeks a very interesting development. Public companies go through an annual proxy and annual shareholder meeting. There are 2 very influential firms that rate every company's proxy, ISS and Glass Lewis. Those 2 firms have come out in the past 2 weeks and have said, for this 2018 cycle, we are going to highlight and note lack of gender diversity on the boards of companies. We are going to recommend to investors. Now think about this. This is Janus Funds, Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, right? Having huge ownership in these companies and huge influence over them. We're going to recommend that those investors really take a look at what else the company is doing because of this lack of gender diversity. One of those firms has come out and said, and next year in 2019, if there are no women on these company boards, we will recommend that investors who are invested in those companies vote against the nominating and governance committee of the board. So this is huge because this starts to say, companies, if you don't start looking at this issue, we're going to vote against your board members. And we're going to start recommending replacements for your board members. So I just think huge groundswell, in part catalyzed by some of the events that we've heard spoken about already, but an incredibly important development and unlike anything I've seen in over 25 years.
And very recently, BlackRock said that they were expecting 2 women on every board, and Vanguard was also very affirmative about expecting gender on their boards.
Right. A very interesting and quick read for any of you is to go read the BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink is his name. It's an open letter to CEOs.
So, Sandy, in your opening comments, you bring a wealth of perspective in your role as managing partner of Deloitte. Tell us about your experience.
Okay. Well, first I need to correct my opening bio. So I'm the former managing partner of Deloitte in Denver. I retire in May after 41 years. with Deloitte. And so we've just appointed my successor, and I'm looking forward to retirement. And after Pam's comments, I couldn't be happier that I'm retiring now and leaving the complex workforce that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to survive if I was sticking around. So, yeah, Deloitte has been a leader. I'm very proud of what Deloitte has accomplished. We've really been a leader in first the Women's Initiative and then Diversity Inclusion. We started our WIN initiative over 25 years ago. And so if you look at, we talk about kind of maturity model for companies, I would put us at the high end of the maturity model. Not that we have solved all problems yet, but we certainly have made huge progress. We have a woman CEO, our business unit leaders are women. We have over half of our new partners and directors are women or minorities. So we've made huge progress in the workforce. Now, in the current environment, we're struggling with a variety of things, and Bill alluded to some changes that we're making. For me personally, and Pam mentioned this, and Bill mentioned this both, of my perspective, we've always had diversity and inclusion backwards. So we're always, and this is, by the way, these are all comments of Sandy Roth, not Deloitte. It always looked to me like we were trying to fix the women or fix the minorities. And the problem is the majority. I mean, the minorities, the women are outstanding performers. It's the majority of kind of changing the attitude. I clearly fall in the clueless stage still to this day, Pam. Because I just, sometimes we just aren't aware, aren't sensitive, haven't lived it, haven't walked in the footsteps. And it's not malicious, it's not even trying, it's just hard and confusing and we don't know what to do. So several years ago, well now it's probably been maybe 10 years ago, I was asked to be the regional inclusion leader for Deloitte, for our region. And so I was the only male in that category, and probably I was the only male in that category of the various regions we had in Denver, in the firm. And very enlightening. I thought I was pretty enlightened. I'll come back to that story maybe. It's not the most proud moment, but I thought I was pretty enlightened, champion of women, mentored, all those kind of things. And then when I got into this situation, it just seemed like it was all upside down and backwards to me. So in Deloitte, we devour talent. That's a positive thing. All we have to sell to our clients is talent. So if you're high performing talent, you're going to do very well at Deloitte. Doesn't matter race, creed, color, gender, whatever it is. And so, but all of our programs for improving diversity, we're taking our top performing minorities or women and developing them or giving them more opportunities. And yet they were already high performing by their selection process. And they had no problem. They were fitting in well, they were included, they were leaders in our firm. What we needed to do was convert more of so we had a 5-tier rating system, 1 through 5, 1 being the highest. We always kept selecting the ones to go through this program. Well, they were already good. I mean, it was like, what are we doing? We needed to convert and develop and help 3s become 1s. So to me, it was all kind of backwards. And the same thing in the women's initiative. It was, well, we'll teach them how to network. We'll teach them how to do this. We'll do that. That wasn't the problem. It was the men. It was the men that was the problem. And so we, at one of our national called Win 16, it was kind of the regional leaders and industry leaders and functional leaders. And again, I think I was the only male there. We were discussing how do we get the men involved. And so there was this great idea seemingly of, well, let's put into every male partner's goals that they'll mentor and coach 1 woman. And then everybody accepted that and go, oh, that's great. I kind of raised my hand, I go, half the men partners shouldn't be counseling anybody, let alone a woman. And all of a sudden, all the women in the room go, you could see in their eyes the reflection of one male partner they knew should not be coaching or counseling a woman. So we didn't pursue that idea. And there's two lessons there. One, we really need to include the majority in everything that we do in diversity. And two, it seems that my exposure was nobody wants to criticize anything that's got diversity or inclusion written on it. So there's a lot of bad ideas in diversity and inclusion that are adopted because no one wants to raise their hand and say, that's really a bad idea, that's not going to work. So I felt like I made great progress in the firm to not let us go down that path that we were headed to. We still needed to solve the problem of how to get men engaged, but it really takes an open dialogue. It takes, I feel like we kind of, or back to Pam, she talked about the silent middle. I think it's just the scared middle. I'm kind of in that scared middle of just not knowing at times what to do and how to respond. So that's kind of my experience with Deloitte. I think you asked, well, we'll come back, but my experience has been working in a great firm that's been champions and leaders. Doesn't mean we still have it right and don't have some progress to make. But I really believe what we heard from both Bill and Pam this morning, it should be about engaging the majority, not focus solely on the silos or the minorities.
Thank you. Jolynn, I know you are very actively involved in the Women's Leadership Foundation and other organizations advancing women. Tell us your story. What is your perspective?
Well, my story probably starts with my first career step, which was to join the telephone company. Do you remember when it was called the telephone company? And so I joined at a time when there was a test, and if you were an incoming employee and you were a woman and you made over that certain level, you went to a high-level non-management job. And if you were a man and you took the very same test and you made over that same level, you went into a management job. Now, AT&T was not the only company doing this, but AT&T had a lot of written policies. And so they were the subject of the largest EEOC consent decree. So my first 5 years of my career, I saw a transformation. I saw there's only one woman in middle management in the whole company of tens of thousands. And at the end of 5 years, we'd made progress. There were more. And so one of the things that I saw living and just coming into the work environment in a large multinational corporation was that different leaders mattered, because in my company, our leaders were complying. But in some of the other operating companies, the leaders understood and embraced and wanted to make a difference. And you could see the difference in the change. And then through consolidation, we came together and we took the best of each. And I was very proud when I left the company in 2000 with Quest acquisition of US West. We had over twice as many women on our board as the S&P 500. We had over twice as many officers that were women, and that we had also the best shareholder value appreciation of the 7 Bell operating companies over that intervening period between the breakup of AT&T and US West acquisition. And that was something we always wanted to do. We wanted to pair this partnership of women and men leading a company with great results. And so I loved it, and we had a good experience with our employee resource groups. You mentioned that, Bill, and we found that as a vehicle to help people look beyond their own current function and to really see the big picture of the company. And we had women and men leaders speaking, and we built informal relationships. And we were able to, I think, make a difference with both the men that came to visit said, oh, this isn't so scary. I sort of like them, and they are interested. And by the way, they asked me great questions. And we I think over the time and with our leaders' support, we made great progress. So then I left. And I had to say, what's next in my life and what should I do? And I pursued a consulting career and I traveled internationally and all. But I was lucky enough to say, I want to make Colorado my home again and get involved here in Colorado, and where can I make a difference? And I looked around and I found that the one group that I saw that a passion for was the Women's Leadership Foundation, because they were concerned with women on boards. And do you know how many women on boards we have on Colorado publicly traded companies? Any guesses? Well, right now, you might have thought that Colorado would be a leader because we are so progressive in so many areas, but unfortunately, we're at 12%. So we are lagging. As a matter of fact, of the 24 states that have 10 or more Fortune 1000 companies headquartered in their state, Colorado is second to last. The only state lower is Oklahoma. So what I'm encouraged by is a lot of people care about that and want to change it. There are a lot of CEOs, there are a lot of board directors, there are a lot of investors, there are a lot of people that are coming together and saying, we will do better, we can do better, and we're going to do better. And I am excited to see so many people here today, because I think that what we have the opportunity to do is to build that support so Colorado is a leader, and that we really are role modeling that women and men in equal partnership leading our organizations to success. And I think that is at the heart of what gender ethics is all about.
Thank you, JoLynn. Jane, so you mentioned that you were the only woman in the C-suite. What suggestions, what advice would you have both for the women who are finding themselves in that position, as well as the men, and what lessons learned could you pass on?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. You know, I think we all have a voice. I mean, first, number one is to be really good at what you do, right? You have to be able to garner respect and to be able to stand your own ground, often to earn your seat at that table. I will tell you, the company that I just left and had been at for 13 years, the first several years I really did not say much about the situation. And I will also say, for pretty much all of you who are working in organizations of any sort, day-to-day life is really busy. There are a lot of competing pressures, and it's often hard to bring up yet another thing that has to be dealt with. And that certainly was the case at my company. But I think you get to a point, and there was more of an appetite to have the conversation. So really the first thing I did, and I did it through the vehicle of corporate sustainability. So we did not have a function. We made a goal bill to get on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And one of the first things I did in that context was I said, let's pull all of our diversity statistics, and let's look at gender diversity in particular. And I think if you go and take a look at this, there are very few companies that openly publish what their statistics are. I think it was Yahoo who did it 2 or 3 years ago and really were crucified, but they should have been applauded for publishing those. So the first thing I had the company do was first share in the C-suite and at the board level what those diversity statistics were. And we were 40% roughly female globally, and operating in 40 different countries, so different cultures, and we saw different data in different countries, but just broadly, 40-60. As we started going up and we cut it into 3 or 4 tiers, it dropped off precipitously once you got out of that just sort of overall average. And we started talking about that and just being sensitive to who was at meetings, when we had large conferences, who was on the stage. And I found myself in a position of always being that voice. For example, 2 or 3 years ago, we always did a large sales conference. 14,000 employees globally. We had about 2,500 people at this conference. And as I looked at the preliminary agenda, and I looked at the general sessions where all 2,500 people were together, we did not have a single female on the stage to talk about product development or marketing plans or anything else, right? And raised that as an issue and said, we can't go into this session with this complete lack of gender diversity. And it just starts to create awareness. And what happened in that particular instance is the other members of the C-suite started looking around and saying, well, why don't we have this woman do this product demo? She's quite skilled at it. And it was just the awareness that we hadn't chosen anyone to be on that main stage that caused us to look at who actually was qualified to do it. And all of a sudden, probably not 50-50, but we got much closer to 50-50 from zero on that main stage. So I think sometimes just having the courage to be the voice of reason, and in my case anyway, and I think it depends on corporate culture and where you are in this life cycle, it was perfectly well received.
Great, thank you. So Sandy, you have the benefit of working with many companies, very different companies. I think you have observed the best of the best in this arena around gender ethics. And there's some slow to warm, let me call it that. What lessons do you take from that you feel would be instructive for this group?
Okay. Yes, I've seen good practices and bad practices. I've been participants in investigations of some poor practices, probably. I guess the observation I would have is the larger companies, and certainly the public companies, do a much better job than the smaller private companies. And that's because of both transparency, outside pressure, investors play a role, the shareholders play a role, and all those things kind of force change and may be dragging them, but they're still making progress and they're going forward. So when there's less transparency or less outside pressure, if it's a smaller private company or just a private company, a little more insular, probably not as high performing as it is, which really says diversity is good, right? It's the result that's diverse that's causing it to be. I wasn't going to debate you, Jane, but I might suggest that companies are successful. They're diverse because they're successful, not because they're successful because they're diverse. And so, that cause and effect is not always understood at times. And so I think the companies that are high performing just do the right thing, hire better people, provide better benefits, realize they got to do things, and that breeds success. So chicken or egg, which you start, may not matter, and you kind of have to go both ways. As far as what they're doing better, I think the things that Bill talked about and Pam talked about, there's some good things that are just better practices. And the companies that get that are doing those things. And they're all in different maturity. I alluded to that earlier. I think companies go through a maturity cycle on diversity and inclusion. And it's not linear, it's choppy. And I think right now we're going through one of those inflection points where we thought we were doing pretty well, and then, oh, that's happening? Well, I guess we need to do something better. And so we're going to learn from that and adjust for that and go forward. But every company goes through those cycles. They have bad experiences, and those are learning. You learn by touching the hot iron. You learn by doing good things and being rewarded. Every company, to me, has to kind of go through that process to, get better. So I don't think there's any silver bullet, and I think different companies are different stages. In Deloitte, we can talk later if you want. We've just kind of revamped what we did. So the things we were doing we realized what we were doing 20 years ago isn't working for us today. We're in a different place, and what we needed wasn't that what we were doing was wrong. We just have to do something different. We're not achieving the results we want because we're doing the same things. We're still doing the same things. And so we kind of stepped back and talked to our people, and we've revamped that. So I think it should be a constant learning process. And if there's an observation I would have in corporate America, I think we're still generally stuck in the last 25 years in what was the initial phase of D&I, and now it needs to go to another level.
Thank you. So, Jolynn, in the work of getting women on boards, we often hear, maybe not enough, but we do hear of the economic advantages to having 3 or more women on a board. Higher return on equity, higher return on invested capital, higher return on sales. But we also have now documented that there is a cultural impact, such as 40% fewer restatements. What would you say contributes to that? Why is it when you have 3 or more women on a board that the ethical issues are also much more attended to?
Yeah, I think that is very interesting. And just a couple of ways of responding. First is, why 3 or more? I think you probably heard about tokens. And a lot of times if there's just one, like you feel like a token, you feel like you have to, it's not the same dynamic. But if you have 3, each begins to be perceived as an individual and make individual contributions. And I think, Dan, we were talking about a board you were on that you saw such a difference. There was one woman on the board, she was talented, but she didn't speak nearly as much in the board meeting as she did when you were talking to her individually. But then when the second woman was joined, the dynamics changed. But the thing is, the dynamics don't just change between the women, the dynamics change with the whole board. And the conference board did a study, and they said that women bring higher effort norms. They come to that meeting very well prepared and with a lot of diligence. And they're excited. This is an opportunity, and they're going to bring their best to the board. But what begins to happen is it affects the whole board. And the men who are there too, who may have had a casual, trusting relationship with the CEO and have just felt everything was good as it was, are now beginning to say, that's a good question. Yeah, maybe I should ask more questions. Maybe the whole diligence and that responsibility, the fiduciary responsibility of being a board member, which NACD and others are really talking about, good governance, begins to take hold and permeate. So it's not only fewer financial restatements. There was another study that independently said there are fewer governance controversies. There is a lot of things that happen that are just good business practice. And I think it's that active engagement and the dynamics of the whole board that make that happen.
Thank you, Jolynn. Okay, so I'm going to randomly pick this table. Eye contact. Who is the person at your table that has a question for our panelists? Yes, you, sir. Blue shirt.
We really got really stuck on the barriers to making these changes, really understanding what the problems are before we can even start to address the solutions. So we talked a lot about having role models and how to make that known, as well as really impacting the organizational culture. So I guess kind of opening it up a little bit more of, how do you address some of those barriers by shifting the culture?
So I'm going to turn to you, Jane, because I know for a time you also headed up human resources. or it reported up to you. Talk to us about role models and mentors.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question's great, and I think you phrased it in a terrific way too. Culture is so important here, right? And I think some of this board diversity and C-suite diversity really does have a very big impact on the culture of a particular organization. I think it is hard for these things to happen organically, and we heard both keynotes talk about some of the challenges. You certainly could set up programs around mentoring, and I've done this in my company, around mentoring and special career tracking. Sandy, I think you talked about what order this should come in trying to develop people that you've identified. But you know, I think again, really, it comes down to culture, and I think it has to be led from the top, and there have to be measurements put in place. So you have to know what the data looks like to begin with, as I spoke about previously. But what I started to see move the needle for us is when we actually put hardcore measurements in place. And I think what is measured is managed. And when you start incentivizing managers at all levels within an organization around their development of the people on their team equally, and maybe with a focus toward women, you start putting more women into leadership positions. Those role models are incredibly important. And when I was leading HR and traveling around the world, what I heard over and over again, not surprisingly, more in regions in the Asia Pacific, in countries in the Asia Pacific where there were so few women in leadership, and had some very talented women that just kept saying, I don't even see what my path is, because I just don't see anyone at a higher level here. And so again, I think it really can't happen organically. I think from the top, there have to be targets and goals set, and those numbers need to be increased, and then managers and leaders throughout the organization need to have an incentive and be very clear that they too are going to be measured on this to help move the needle at all.
Yes.
Can I just comment on that as
Certainly.
well? Because you framed it, I like the way you framed it, is there is a huge amount of inertia and momentum in organizations. And by definition, it goes with the majority. The larger the mass, the more the inertia, I think, if I get back to my science correctly. And so what I found as I kind of did deeper dives on this was, everybody needs the same thing. Everybody needs mentoring, coaching, career development, career planning, name any of the things that our HR functions try to do. It doesn't matter if you're a white male or a woman or anything else. We all need the same thing. But what I find happens is there's inertia that just kind of carries white male through that process. And it gets back to, I didn't think we were very good at doing it for anybody, because kind of back to Deloitte, we move so fast and we have such high expectations. And if you're doing that, then that's great. And if you're not doing that, we don't always stop to pause and even really realize it. We're just always, we're always client focused, and we're off doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so my word I've adopted more recently is being deliberate. So it's not that you have to do things differently for the different constituents. You just have to be more deliberate at times for certain groups, because the inertia won't pull them through like it will for white males. And that's not malicious, it's not biased, it wasn't intentional. It's just kind of inertia, just things happen. I would argue if we went back and did the right things for everybody, we wouldn't have the issue and everybody would get it. It's not because we were coaching and counseling white men better or differently or more, just they got sucked through the system in a different way when it was less deliberate. So to me, if there's a solution, a good solution, it would be doing a better job at those things that people need to succeed. And if you do that for everybody, everybody's going to succeed.
Right.
Okay.
We actually started to talk about gender equity in the context of human equity, especially when you're dealing with 14,000 people globally in very different countries and cultures. And just making sure we started using a language around making sure that every single colleague in our company could reach their full potential, and that we as a company were helping to support them in reaching full potential, whether they were male or female.
So I'm going to call on the table in the middle. Who's got the yellow mark in the table in the middle? Yes.
Interestingly enough, many of the
Could you speak louder, please?
sure, many of the topics that ran through our discussion have already run through some of the comments that the panelists have made, as well as the first question. We talked very much about, if we look at the root cause for some of the things that we've seen so recently around gender inequities and lack of ethics around gender, it comes down to power differentials. And what we talked a lot about is that new leaders, the leaders of today, need to look different than the leaders of the 1980s, the 1990s, and the aughts. And what good leadership looks like needs to be inclusive of the kinds of things like gender equity. And how do you bring people to their full potential, not just a certain class of individuals? Well, that brought us to the question of, well, what is power? What do we mean by power? And we talked about that power is achieved through success. Success is defined by those metrics and those goals and those objectives that are incentivized, particularly through compensation, as well as the types of things that if particular expectations are not met, there are severe, significant, and visible consequences when those expectations are not met. So we talked a lot about power, and we talked a lot about what it means. And so the question that we came up with is, how do you really balance and level set power and the power dynamic within an organization, and do it in a way that's going to be visible for the organization and help the organization in the long run, not just the short run?
Who on the panel would like to take that easy question? Jolynn, go for it.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, it's very important. And, you know, I think we were saying earlier that absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've heard that adage. And I think that the point that Cindy made is that when there is transparency and when there are checks and balances, it helps. And so I think a lot of it is having an outlet. But I also think that I've noticed a difference in what leaders think their role is. You know, I mean, a very simple thing is, are you visualizing this pyramid where the leader is on top and everyone below is serving the leader? Or are you thinking more about your responsibility, your customers, who you're serving? And if you're picturing that customer in the middle, and you're realizing that sometimes that frontline employee, the woman that is cleaning the room in the hotel, the people that are on the service line in fast food, they are the ones that are really representing your company to the customer. And so I think it's really how you visualize who has power, but power for what? And if the power is really to fulfill the company's mission Yes, you have stakeholders. Yes, you have the investors you need to please with your quarterly results. But you have customers that if you and your whole company that's serving those customers are not aligned to serve them well over time, you're not going to be successful. And your other stakeholder is your employees. And respecting every one of those employees, feeling that you have a responsibility to each of them to realize their potential, I think makes a big difference. So, Dan, when we were talking about ethics and some of the other words that go with that, you know, the integrity, the way you see yourself if you are the leader, and what you think your power is for, I think makes a big difference. And I do think it takes a bit of humility. I think sometimes we're used to people wanting to please us and wanting to, and you can get an inflated ego sometimes that is not really in touch. And that's why I think spending time on the front line, spending time with the employees, spending time with customers that don't mind telling you what you're doing wrong, it just gives you balance.
So one last comment, and I will turn it back over to you, Dan.
Yeah, again, coming back to the BlackRock CEO's letter, he talks in there about purpose and about, as an investor, they are going to start evaluating companies on their purpose, the way they operate versus what their purpose is. And they want to see that purpose include covering topics like diversity, like operating with a very strong value system as a company. So he says we're going to start focusing a lot more on culture and on the company's impact to the community and the words that the company uses to describe its role in the broader universe and the broader community. I think, and Sandy mentioned this about transparency, social media has totally changed the pressure on companies because it's just much harder to hide. And something goes wrong or someone sees something they don't like, and social media provides a vehicle to make those sorts of issues much more transparent. Anyone who's looked around on Glassdoor can sort of see what others have said about a company. So again, coming back to culture, I think it becomes much harder for companies to hide. In order for them to sustain in the long term, they really need to get on some of these issues. I do think it strongly comes down to leadership. I've had a long career. Early in my career, the people with power were not necessarily the smartest or the most successful. It had to do with their networks and relationships, which women were often left out of. I think that has started to shift quite a bit too.
So before I turn it over to Dan, I started out by saying that we are all leaders among leaders. So I encourage you to take an action. Decide before you walk out the door, what is one thing that you will do to help advance gender ethics? Okay, one more question. All right, a table that's eager to present a question that perhaps we haven't heard yet. Does someone have, right here, okay, I have a nominee, what is it, a voluntold.
I just want to say first that Sandy's comment about bad ideas in D&I really resonated. I think probably it's born out of, in a lot of cases, clueless sort of lack of knowing what to do or how to proceed. But one of the things that our table talked about is that I think there's a trend when an executive becomes aware, whether through a survey or some other means, that there's a problem with probably gender equity or some other diversity inclusion issue within their team. Usually when it's a gender issue, they task their senior female leaders with hosting a meeting or doing something to figure out what's going on or what's wrong. And then that puts the female leaders in the position of talking to all the females in the department, let's say, and then having to put themselves in the front line of potential career suicide, of feeding back to that senior leader, well, it's your leadership style, or it's the company, or it's something, and then it's suddenly a female issue, and it's potentially your fault or something's wrong with you. I don't know if you guys have any experience with such things or ideas about what to do, because going to HR, for example, HR is not your friend. They're there for the company. I mean, we've all heard that over and over again. So you can't go to HR because then you're the problem, right? It's you just put a big X on your head like a target, right? I don't know the best way to proceed with I think you have to get everyone in the room to have the discussion about what's going on. You have to have the men in the room, you have to have the women, you have to have people of color, whatever the issue is. Do you have a suggestion?
So I have a suggestion.
Yes.
I was Chief Human Resource Officer for 4 companies, and somewhere along the career path, the light went on, and it's a very simple strategy, and I call it bring your friends along. So if you are tasked with that, then you look at a colleague, you look at a manager, you look at a senior person or more, and you say, we are going to do this. And it's amazing what happens. First of all, it does diffuse the issue of, well, now I'm the spokesperson for every difficult issue and all women's issues. And I think that different people listen to different leaders in different ways. And so you're not becoming an ally, you're becoming a partner, and you're becoming an activist. You're action oriented in doing that. So that's one suggestion, but I'll turn to the panel. Any other suggestions?
No, I mean, I would agree with you, and I've done this many, many times, is just grab one of my male colleagues, and often, honestly, they've been very flattered by the ask to help in a situation like this, because I think foundationally, at least a lot of the men I worked with, they believed strongly in this.
All right.
I guess the only last thing is do have courage to speak. We talked about impact, and I'm thinking a little bit of the gun shooting in Florida and the young people speaking. Somehow it's different to my ear, and I think other ears, when I hear a teenager that was actually there impacted by it, speaking authentically about it. And so I agree, bring your friends along, but get the courage to speak about the true impact. And do it in a way that helps create empathy and understanding.
Thank you for a great conversation. There's more practicality came out of this last hour than I often see out of panel discussions. And Gloria, thank you very much for moderating this, and Jane, all your wonderful experiences that we've shared about. Sandy, welcome to retirement. It's very underrated. And Joanne, thank you for all your help. And thanks very much to the Women's Leadership Foundation and to the Colorado Women's College for helping to support this program. It wouldn't have been anywhere near if we hadn't had your 2 organizations and 2 ladies to work with on this. And thank you all for your engagement and your participation and your excellent thinking. One of the things I've got in my notes here is that one of the things I wanted to have happen today was the emergence of a vocabulary that we can all use to strike up conversations with colleagues and citizens. One of the things I found dealing on the ethics issues in boards when I was in that phase of my life and career is that it was very difficult to talk about because nobody knew the right words to use. So I think this has been a very helpful morning. I got lots of new words. Okay, now it's time once again to thank everybody. Congratulations for a terrific panel here. And adjourn this event and send you all back